Hi, welcome to the final in our introductory series of talks to introduce the DPE.tools project. I'm John Byrne, and I'm the lead researcher for the Decentralising Political Economies project, which has kindly been hosted and made possible by Alistair Hudson, who is the director of Whitworth Art Gallery. As you probably know by now, the Decentralising Political Economies project is a collaborative research platform between the Whitworth Art Gallery, the Association of Art AUTEAL, and the City Lab at Liverpool John Moores University's School of Art and Design. And it seeks to propose, to develop and test strategies and projects which use art as a tool for developing ground up social, political and economic change. So I'm really proud and happy to have Alistair Hudson here with us today, who, as I said, has facilitated this project. And I'm lucky enough to have worked with Alistair over nearly a decade and a half now, I think, isn't it, Alistair? On various projects.
Certainly most of this century.
Certainly, yeah, that's a great way of looking at it for most of this century, which is really good. And yeah, there's a couple of questions that I'd really like to put to you, which I think would help put where this project sits and how it developed into a context and into the context of your thinking and of your curatorial activism, I guess. And the first would be, I know that over the last couple of years, you've been increasingly thinking of situating the Whitworth as an exemplar of a constituent or a useful museum. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and what that would entail?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long story, in effect. It's basically the story of 200 years of art that I'll try and condense into a sentence or two. But primarily it's about, for me, it's about moving the idea of the museum from one which is orchestrated around the idea of art as being representational to the idea of art as being operational. So what that means is moving from a space where you show art in an exhibitionary format, and the public, the audience, whoever that other is, the customer, even in kind of recent forms of the museum, basically are encouraged to come through the threshold, experience the art, and really only engage with it in terms of the image of how they understand art as an object. And this is something that's really written in by 200 years of philosophy and behavior in the kind of Eurocentric world, certainly, which has really kind of formed our understanding of art as something we look at principally. And what that means is often you get, despite the best intentions of artists and the art world and people involved in cultural production, art is always severely limited by its ability to actually do anything in the world. It might point at a problem, but it won't actually do anything about it. It might raise an issue or start a conversation, but its ability to go beyond that is always restrained by the fact that people want art to be just art. They don't want it to become other things. So what I'm interested in doing is really taking that step outside of the art world bubble as we've created it, and applying art in social circumstances, in economics, politics, planning, education, health, in ways that art becomes operational rather than representational. So it's actually doing things. You're using art as a process or a tactic to implement change in the world. And to basically that's a way to integrate art into everyday living, or to integrate artistic thinking, artful strategies into everyday living. And of course, that's a really old idea. That's the story of 40,000 years of humanity, in effect. It was only, the last couple of hundred years where we've had this idea of art not doing that. So really, it's about art re-engaging with the world in simple ways, but in ways that is useful to people. So art is a process that is used in order to enhance the world, change the world, improve circumstances, improve life pathways, make the world a better place, for want of being an idealistic person. But it also that idea connects with the origins, in particular, of both the art museums in Manchester, the Whitworth and Manchester Art Gallery, which were designed in effect for that purpose, with a sort of rather Victorian patriarchal sensibility or version of what I've just been describing, but very much as part of the economy of the city.
No, that's fascinating to me, and it immediately raises one of the questions that excuse me, one of the questions that we've already begun to touch on in some of the earlier conversations for the Decentralising Political Economies project, which is, up until now, the difficulty of trying to reconcile one-to-one scale art practices which try to do something in the real world and that don't necessarily do that in order to represent it or document it within the museum and gallery space. And a museum and gallery space that needs to show things about art activity. And it seems to me a really crucial point, because as one-to-one scale practices begin to become more commonplace, for all the right reasons, for example, in the UK, obviously, Assemble winning the Turner Prize would be one instance of that happening. One of the kind of tactical advantage of modernism and modernist art galleries and museums so far has been their ability to rethink their processes of capture so they can stretch themselves out and kind of grasp back alternative forms of practice and make them part of a seamless narrative of modernism. And it seems to me what you want to do with the Whitworth is crucial, because it's you as a director of a museum with a staff and artists and a constituency who want to try and think, okay, what can the alternative to that be? How can the museum itself change itself as a crucial coordinate, so there's no longer that push me, pull me between display of objects and things in the outside world, how they could go together. So beyond,
it must be said, I'm kind of interested in liberating objects from that capture as well. So, for example, you might cite
that's really interesting,
Russian constructivism as an example of what you were just talking about, which was absolutely an art movement, which was about creating a new reality, in a social reality for people, but became ultimately an art movement. In the Alfred Barr diagram, or the Gombrich's History of Art, or whatever, and actually what it was a radical proposition to put art in operation in the real, and it was denied that by the forces of an array of forces entwined with capitalism and industrialization and politics.
No, I think that's also a really interesting and key point. And to underscore that, what are the types of day-to-day ground-up activities that you can envisage strategically beginning to happen, or that could be implementable within a museum and gallery setting in order to make that shift begin to happen?
Well, in a way, the art world's a curious place, because in theory, since 1917, anything can be art. So I'm referring to Duchamp there, of course, for the tape, and that means in theory you can do anything in a museum. You can run a health center, you can run an architectural practice, run a bank. You can do anything in the name of art, but of course the battle is negotiating that with the the inherited structures of the art world, so that you don't get too ostracized and too out on a limb where people go, well, that's irrelevant, it's just some nutcase doing stuff that isn't art, because actually the intention is actually to change art and the public perception and value of it as a whole. So really for me it's about starting to negotiate these territories in the art museum and start to use these art moments in the art museum bit by bit. And I've talked recently very much about, from a theoretical point of view, leaving the exhibitionary era. So if we talked about the exhibitionary era beginning in 1851 with the Great Exhibition, of this idea of so all the contents of the Mechanics' Institute, which were about teaching, learning, developing society, competence in the workforce, etc., were translated into spectacle for primarily a leisure industry, and B a power play on an international stage. It became symbolic in effect rather than operational. If we look at that moment beginning then, I would cite this moment, which you can put any date on it, which is the end of that era, when the exhibition loses its grip on being the kind of prime delivery platform for art. And really where, I do it myself sometimes. I go and see an exhibition and I go, well, what am I actually doing here? What am I looking at? What's the process that's going on here, where I'm going into this room to look at something? Are there other ways in which we can engage with art and have art in our lives? And I think what we've seen recently, and it's been accentuated and highlighted by COVID, but also accentuated and highlighted by technology, and particularly the World Wide Web. So we might see 1989, for example, as the beginning of this end moment of the exhibitionary, of being suddenly people could start to find their creative uses in all different ways of life other than the art gallery, online, on YouTube, in cultural production on their own terms, outside of the hermetically sealed walls of the museum, because previously the museum was the gatekeeper of what was art, but now that's almost it's kind of lost its relevance and its currency, and the proliferation of media and platforms has meant that people can find their art in all kinds of ways. So in a way the museum needs to renegotiate this territory. So in a way, for me, the cycle of producing, putting an exhibition up, it's on for 3 months, then it comes down, then you do another exhibition, and it's kind of a relentless cycle that is stops you implementing art in other ways, because it becomes enormously time consuming and people consuming and resource consuming. It's not particularly ecological. It consumes an enormous amount of resources, including flying stuff around the world in crates from one museum to another. So really, I think what the complexities of that are become, particularly post-COVID, I think become increasingly hard to sustain, and hard to sustain physically and hard to sustain intellectually. And so I guess a lot of what we've been doing is started to, in both galleries in Manchester, start to kind of knock out spaces from being purely exhibitionary. So, for example, Gallery 3 at the Whitworth, there's a kind of a nice little story in a way that when I started, there's a big gallery that overlooks the park, and it's one of the most popular galleries in the park because it has this wonderful view through the trees and the leaves. It's a big cube space. It's very pleasant to be in. But the problem is it's so light. It's actually, from a conservation point of view, it actively damages works of art when you put works of art in there. So we had this kind of discussion in the team about, well, should we put blinds up then and curtains to stop the light coming in so you can actually show art in there? But then the argument is, well, then people don't like that room, and it's not the room you want to be in anymore because it's a kind of a dark, miserable space rather than actually being this wonderful view of the park. So we actually, just as an experiment, took all the art out and said, well, let's use this space in a different way. We put some very, kind of cool, groovy wallpaper on the walls to make it an installation, but using everyday art, i.e. wallpaper. And then it maintains its function as this sort of kind of civic space within the gallery. And then we're in the process, for example, at the moment of turning what was the collection centre, which is sort of this interface between the public and the collection stores, where it basically by habit, it become an exhibition space. Just because I think that's what tends to happen naturally in museums. And we said, well, hang on a minute, no, this is just becoming another exhibition space we have to program, and that costs money and consumes resources. And actually, really what you want this space to be is a place where people use art. They take things from the collection and they use them in, as an educational tool or in art therapy, all kinds of things. So that's basically being remade now as the Collections Care Centre, which is basically about how we use art in therapeutic processes within the health system, which we've already been doing in lots of different ways in the gallery, but suddenly takes it out of that exhibitionary cycle and turns it into perpetual use as a sort of, a kind of health centre within the organisation. But it's also next to the park, so it plugs into our, health and park programme. It connects in with the research centre, so on and so forth. So bit by bit, it's about kind of taking these spaces out of the exhibitionary cycle and putting them into perpetual use as places where people can engage with art in other ways.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really key set of points, I think, again. And I know one of the reasons you've been supportive of and behind and instigated the Decentralising Political Economies research platform is so that it could be an active part of that thinking. But what's been striking me over the last couple of months as we've been putting the DPE.tools project together is something you just touched on as well, is that when we were working on the Constituent Museum project with the Internationale, I started to think of the term negotiating jeopardy, which the idea of how you can relax the kind of structural, which you just described very well as the ideological frameworks of museum and gallery space, and how that of necessity needs to be an ongoing series of negotiations. But I think you've hit a really interesting point there as well, which is part of that complexity, which is that since 1989, since the development of Web 2.0 and Web 3.0 platforms for self-production, and given the lineage from 1917 when anything can be art, one of the roles and functions of the museum and gallery, of course, which we all know, but we don't like to talk about very much, is actually become about bracketing off something which is essentially the same as everything else to look at. Mm-hmm. So you can still recognize it as art, mm-hmm. As if it goes with outside those confines, it's impossible to tell the difference. And along with that, there are a set of values, some of them good, some of them not so good, about the kind of protection of almost a Western Enlightenment dream, which was art, was about protecting the Western subject yet to be before it was realized. And it seems to me that the kind of things that you're suggesting are about becoming more strategically flexible in what art is, could become, who could become involved in making it and producing it, as a means for us to begin to construct and rethink through much more varied and flexible forms of identities which are up to speed for the kind of circumstances we find ourselves in, especially post-COVID. And one of the things I wanted to kind of tie that to perhaps was the work that which I've joined in with over many years, the work that you've done using John Ruskin as a kind of cipher for developing that thinking and connecting it back to almost that point before which that work with art at the Centre of Mechanics Institute suddenly became spectacle.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing about him is, he's incredibly sort of complex and flawed character, but that's exactly it. It's better to think of him as a cipher, or a kind of a carrier somehow of ideas, and not to cite him as a genius at the center of all things, because there were lots of bad ideas he had as well.
No, absolutely.
And also because this, what we're talking about in the post-exhibitionary with Arthur Till, is a process of demodernization as well as decolonization, a way of rebalancing the global economy and global politics, so that we kind of we can release ourselves from all those problematics of industrialization, capitalism, and the structures that have created so much inequality in the world. And I think what he was endeavoring to do, although in lots of flawed, complicated ways, was trying to create equality, or trying to create a form of equality. I mean, he didn't actually believe in it. He was sort of arch Tory, really. He didn't really, from the old school, as he would say. But it was about a redistribution of the economy that worked for a wider number of people. And I think that's now, post-COVID, what's like, being laid clear is it's as bad, if not worse, than in Victorian times in some ways at the moment, in terms of financial equality, race, power, agency, all these things. So I think a principal ambition is to make the museum and the art gallery and actually the park in Manchester's case, the site for a democratic reformation of culture, and therefore of the economy and society. It's a place where we might convene to test out new ideas and to share possibilities of how things might be done, even if it's in small experiments. But in order to do that, you have to create a space where people feel at home. And at the moment, and this is partly to do with the exhibitionary model, and it's partly to do, and it's also it's to do with the language of the contemporary and the modern, and all those structures that are built into the art system. I mean, you can. It's quite funny, through COVID, there's been all this work around anti-racism. I mean, we could argue that art in itself is actually racist. You could by its very structure. So we need to disassemble those structures in the museum in order to allow other forms of use of art, other forms of use of culture, other forms of use of these public spaces where people feel it is part of their daily life. So if you're inviting someone from down the road who, I mean, let's face it, in schools now, people for art, if they study art at all, they probably look at Warhol and Banksy. And, certainly my kids do. It's not really it's not really a deep understanding actually of what art is in a way that could be taught in schools. And that's another challenge and another question for another day. But if you're asking people to step out of the behavioral patterns and worlds they normally inhabit and come into a sort of avant-garde art installation, they're either going to go, I mean, of course they like lots of us, they may go, wow, this is really unusual and cool and stimulates me in all kinds of ways, but ultimately what does this do for me? What relevance does this have? And I think there are ways in which we can just reprogram the way art works and the way people engage with it, and reinvent it so that people come into it and go, wow, this is really, I'm going to come here every day because I know it will do this for me. Or I know that sort of the art structure, whatever that is, can inform and enhance my day-to-day practice. And that's in a way really where something like Arthur Till comes in. And I actually had a very interesting conversation today, because we've been, as part of our sort of Arthur Till program, where we're going to turn one of the spaces into the Whitworth into the sort of Office of Useful Art the Arte Utile archive room, the kind of common room, kind of meeting space for different constituent groups, director's office, just kind of a hangout space, but then use the archive, use works from the archive to think, well, what could we do? How could we apply these case studies anew? And one of those projects we're looking at is Suzanne Lacey's Oakland Projects, where she worked with basically Black youth in Oakland, in the Bay Area of California in the 1990s, over a 10-year period, to basically broker relations between Black youth and the police, and basically the people in power within that part of the city structure. And it was, kind of very successful. It was, had all kinds of youth programs where you were basically giving agency and voice through media literacy, in that case TV, to give them a voice and to tell their truth and to speak to power, which had, a really, really amazing effect. So we were looking at as a gesture. So next year we're planning this Suzanne Lacey retrospective, but the idea is it's not the exhibition as an exhibition. We're talking about it as being an exhibition as a manual, where you basically use that as a manual for social change. So here's all these examples of Suzanne Lacey doing all these social projects, throughout her career. What can we take from these and implement in real life? Well, however it's called. And so we were developing this idea. Well, we started this work making looking at how we could remake Oakland projects in Manchester now, in an age of social media and the digital, rather than the world of analog TV from the 1990s. And that's been developing, but it kind of rather serendipitously at the same time, there's a kind of a youth group from Moss Side in Manchester who basically are trying to tackle gang culture, knife crime, shootings, all the stuff that's going down in Moss Side, to change pathways for young people, had seen Oakland projects from afar, contacted Suzanne Lacey in LA, saying, "Oh, we're really interested in Oakland projects. We'd really like to do something like this in Manchester." Unbeknown that 200 yards down the road, we were actually thinking of this idea at the same time. So suddenly all these things connected. So suddenly that becomes a project, which is not about making an art project. It's about using art processes and people in order to implement strategies and tactics for that community to make real change happen and affect the life prospects of those young people in Moss Side and those communities of Moss Side now, with a long-term ambition, rather than just doing a show for 3 months.
That's just an amazing kind of, on one hand it's a serendipity, but on the other hand it kind of illustrates a lot of the points that I think you've been making and what we want to try to examine more. I know for many years now, those of us who've been interested in useful art have become quite used to the early accusation that anything to do with the process of aligning art to use would somehow be raising a white flag of surrender to instrumentalize neoliberalism. And of course, our argument, as I've outlined in earlier conversations with the DPE site so far, is that the situation that became part of this shift to globalized neoliberalism was that the territory within which we all operate is far more nuanced and complex and entwined and asymmetrical in that it's museums and galleries were becoming part of an ideological proposition that you could still simply step away from all of that into a neutral space where art could be useless. And of course, that art was part of a system of ownership which was more complicit with neoliberal than anything else. However, equally at the same time, of course, any uses of art, whether they be for social good or whether they be to attempts to produce useless art objects, can be either neoliberal or against the grain, as we've been saying. It's not the tools you choose to pick up, it's how you use the tools that you pick up.
And also I think that criticism of useful art misunderstands the wider meaning of use, because also in that what we have been talking about a lot is the fact that also that includes misuse as well. So it allows for subversion, and in a way encourages subversion as well. And rather than instrumentalization, a lot of these projects actually are working in a more challenging way than the conservative traditions of radicalism, if that makes sense. So, again, I was having a conversation with someone else earlier today who said, everyone in the art world, they're not an art world person, and they sort of said, people in the art world keep talking about how radical everything is, and it all just looks like art. And I think there's something in that. For me, the really liberating thing about arte util is it allows you to escape that performative radicalism, as I call it, and allows you to do operational radicalism. And sometimes that involves working within the system. It involves kind of piggybacking and working in the cracks and
hacking.
Using some of those neoliberal structures to kind of undermine them and subvert them from within. I mean, for example, the Nuria Guel project, where she basically creates an offshore bank account in a tax haven for a kind of radical housing cooperative to kind of abuse all the systems and privileges that the 1% have. So I think that's often a misunderstanding. Is we're not doing this. None of these projects are doing this to deliver an agenda from a kind of top tier. We're doing it very much from ground up.
I agree. For me, it's about engaging in a site of struggle that's already been largely co-opted by neoliberal rhetoric, which it's been well documented how well managerial speakers use most of the languages of the alternative avant-garde that began to grow in the early 20th century for its own purposes. But probably in the light of what you're saying, one of my last question for this particular discussion, we obviously must have more as the project develops, is I know that on the horizon line for the Whitworth, you're developing a show, Economics the Blockbuster, and which is again an arena that you're presenting within which some of these discussions and possibilities and problematics can be rigorously engaged with, because I'd agree with you, we're now kind of past the push me pull me conversation of is it useful, is it useless. It's like, let's see what we can do and evaluate that, because it's a much more pressing set of problems in the current kind of climate that we find ourselves in, especially with the battles that will go on for kind of our very identities in a post-COVID world. Could you explain some of your thinking behind Economics the Blockbuster and what it might become, and some of your ambitions for that show?
I mean, in simple terms, it was like a lot of things that you invent. It's sort of a proposition, to be a slightly perverse proposition, to throw a spanner in the works as part of that process of change. And so obviously in thinking about the post-exhibitionary, it seemed fitting that we should have an exhibition to end all exhibitions. And what better way to do it than to do a blockbuster exhibition, or to use the blockbuster format to do something that is the most unblockbuster friendly subject matter ever. And in fact, I think Poppy, the curator that's working on the project at the Whitworth, she looked back, and apparently the Hayward Gallery did a show about economics in, I can't remember, one in the 1970s, I think, and it was on record as the least popular exhibition the Hayward has ever done.
Yes.
So I thought, well, let's set out for a challenge. But it was partly because economics is everything. It is the big subject of our times.
Yeah.
And I would include environment and ecology within that as well.
Yeah.
And it does stem from that thinking that we talked about with John Ruskin. So John Ruskin's, and this again was sort of the first proposition show that we did under my tenure at the Whitworth, which was Joy Forever, which was the subtitle for John Ruskin's lecture on the political economy of art from 1873, and which was his riposte to capitalism, and sowed the seeds for the labor movement, for kind of alternative forms of economics, for the National Health Service, public housing, all these sorts of things that are now considered much the terrain of the left. So it kind of wanted to be part of that lineage. I wanted the whole institution to have a story of transition that begins there and then culminates in this blockbuster exhibition, which kind of pulls everything apart and kind of tries to explain the world. It's like, how can we, if a museum is the place where we write the story of our culture and we write the proposition of what the future might be, what would be the most relevant thing we could talk about now? And for me, that is economics. In a way, it's sort of like the great unsaid. Nobody understands it. I mean, that's half the problem. It's a bit like art. It is an art form in its own right. It was created as a kind of humanities subject. It was created as an art form primarily, rather than the science, and actually sort of became a kind of pseudoscience in fiscal terms anyway. But actually, it's to say, no, economics is more than just guys in suits in metropolitan cities pressing buttons and making money. It is the operating system of society. That's what economics is. It's how you look after your world and the people in it. And that needs to be, for me, this is the moment more than ever probably in that post-1989 moment where Europe and the West and white culture has quite rightly lost its grip on the world. And we open everything out in a new way. And sort of the fundamental economic systems are at the root of how we change all that, if we're going to change anything, because that's what's dictating behavior, the structures that are creating inequality. So basically the idea was to do a show which kind of tries to explain all that, tries to pull it all apart and propose new ways of thinking about that. And I suppose in parallel, as a kind of allegory, looking at the way that art has been manipulated in respect of this.
Sure.
I mean, the story of art as we know it pretty much goes hand in hand with the story of economics as a theory. And also I kind of wanted to make it a work in progress, that in a way it was almost like a myth that started, like we'd started talking about it now as economics the blockbuster. We don't know what the hell the show is going to be or what's going to be in it. We've got some ideas, of course, but the idea was you a bit in the way that kind of economics and world of business operates now, is it's all about the story. It is actually ultimately about aesthetics. If we look at the way the world is now, storytelling aesthetics are one of the prime drivers. You only have to look at what's happening in the world of politics right now to know that the box cover is far more important than the machinery underneath it. So it was really to kind of to expose and talk about that in order to get it out of our system, and move on to something else.
That again, that's a really incredible, I think, and very insightful mapping out of some of the processes that you want to undertake via and with the Whitworth. And with that, I'm going to probably draw this, I hope, part one of our ongoing discussions to a close. But of course, and I know you know this because you helped set the project up and instigated it in the first place. The whole idea of decentralizing political economies is not to present responses to works or activities that have already been done, and simply to archive them, but to produce new and more complex debates which we can begin to identify and think through. So I'd like, in the very near future, once we've begun to identify some of those key themes and issues, of course, to invite you back for your ideas and opinions on those, and to be a key driver in that debate. And thank you very much. Really great interview. Thank you.
No, it's a pleasure. It's a good moment. I just talking about economics. I now have to go to the shop and buy some creme fraiche.
Yeah.
So that's it. That's probably a good juncture, and then we can pick it up. Maybe we should start we start part 2 with what happened to the creme fraiche.
Well, what happened to the creme fraiche is the beginning of part 2,
and maybe what happened to shops. Shops might not exist anymore. The next time we can.
Yeah, that's it. That's if you find one that's open at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah,
I think. Yeah. In tier 3. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful as always, and great to talk.
Good to talk to you, John.
Very, very soon.
Very good.
Thanks, Alistair.